Hi, my name is Alex Voigt. I'm an eighth grade social studies teacher at YZ Essential Middle School. And for my project here, I'm going to be doing a teacher workshop on building classroom culture and community, mostly detailing what it is, why it matters, and how to do it. This is a topic I was really interested in doing because when I think back about my experiences as a first year teacher and early on in my teaching career, classroom culture and community was something that I really didn't know a lot about, and it was something I kind of struggled with in the early stages. And I think by like trying to pay it forward for some of the things I've learned over the years, I think that might be kind of useful. And I'm doing this under the assumption that this would be some sort of like workshop that would be done during professional development in the early part of the school year or during workshop week. So it'd be something that people could internalize as students are coming into the classroom. Now, learning objectives here are that people can explain the importance of building classroom culture, identify general considerations to keep in mind when building classroom culture, and also uncover some community building strategies and activities that a teacher would potentially want to use in their own classroom. Now, I teach social studies, so some of these things might be a little bit more social studies centric. But I would actually say a lot of them, especially the icebreaker activities, could work in any type of classroom. And some of the stuff that's more social studies centric could probably be tilted a little bit to be toward a class of different topics. Now, a startup activity that I wanted to do with this, and it's something that I would have teachers do in the workshop, is to write a class review of themselves. Most teachers have looked at like either Rate My Teacher or Rate My Professor at some point or another. And this is kind of done in the spirit of that. And it's based off of an activity advocated by Dave Burgess in his book, Teach Like a Pirate. So the instructions for this is that they would be given a blank sheet of paper, and a teacher would then take 5 minutes to write a review of their class from the perspective of a fictional student. They can base it off of any sort of comments they've received from actual students, or they can come up with something completely different. And whatever the case is with your review that you come up with, you try to think of what you would want your your students to remember about your class going forward. I'm not going to do the full 5 minutes for the sake of this presentation because it's not an actual workshop, but that's kind of how we would do it with that, and with soothing music to go with it. Now, after they finish the class review, the purpose of it really is to construct a vision of what you want your students to experience in your class. And it also serves as an ideal goal for teachers to shoot for when kids step into the classroom for the first time. Uh, Even when you're an experienced teacher, that first day of school, when kids first come into your class, can be a little nerve wracking. And this is the sort of thing you can kind of keep in mind when teachers are seeing their kids for the first time. And I'd also recommend tucking this review away in a desk drawer so a teacher could potentially refer back to it whenever they're feeling like they're lacking motivation or inspiration. Okay, so when looking at building classroom culture, we first have to kind of describe what it is. And this quote from an education writer actually sums it up pretty well in that a classroom is a place in which students feel cared about and are encouraged to care about each other. They experience a sense of being valued and respected. The children matter to one another and to the teacher. They have come to in the plural. They feel connected to each other. They are part of an us. Or to put this in more concrete terms, because I tend to be more of a concrete thinker, classroom culture is the vision of what we want our classroom to be for our students when it comes to things like day-to-day procedures, how students interact with each other, how students interact with you, values you want to emphasize, messages you send to students when they walk in the classroom, like both verbal, nonverbal, all that stuff, the enthusiasm that you create for learning, and the supports you offer for those who are struggling, and just so many other things beyond that. It's the things that we really don't think are important when we're building our curriculum because we're constantly looking at academic standards, what's been done in the past for specific content. and what we need to do to get to a summative. But in reality, these things end up mattering a lot more than anything else that's in the standards, because if you can't really lay out the classroom community or classroom culture part of this, the content area stuff, you could be the most knowledgeable person in the world about it, and it's still not really going to matter to a lot of kids. So, why it matters, there's a lot of things, and this is all going to be stuff that has a little bit more of an academic backing. Students perform better in the classroom. Here's a quote from an OECD study about this. It also makes a teacher's job a lot easier. Poor classroom environments are generally associated with poorer levels of student aggression, peer relations, and academic focus. And there are other studies that would link it to being less likely to have discipline issues or students having less discipline issues. It also helps build empathy and healthy relationships, because teachers who consider relationships within students to be important are more likely to have greater trust and cooperation, for even from students who have histories of discipline infractions. And this is just kind of my own opinion. Being a part of a community is really an important thing to learn, and that's something that can be done at any education level. And it's important to start early with that and build from there. So, some key things to consider when building a classroom community. And this is going to be a lot of stuff from Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching and Learning, which is a book I read for my education class. The first thing, do you have the 3 R's being practiced, which is respect, relationship, and rapport? And these are things that you can model to students, and also that you can reinforce and remind students of constantly. Are they respecting each other and yourself? Are you actively building relationships with them, and are they trying to establish that with you? And then when it comes to rapport, you kind of take that relationship and help build rapport from there, with regards to, how you interact with certain kids and how you get them to do what you need them to do for an activity. And then the other question is, do you have the 3 P's approach, which is being positive, proactive, and procedures? Positive kind of speaks for itself, even though I think there is some nuance to that, because we're not always going to be the happy, cheerful, smiley teacher. At least I know I'm not. But you can be a teacher that focuses on positive interactions with kids rather than jumping to the worst possible conclusion with things. And you can also try to put the best face on things when you can, and also even explain to students that I'm having a rough day, but I'm going to do my best to be positive with this, or to present this in the best way that I can. So that way it models that behavior. And then proactive is really, I think of it in the terms of like classroom management, being able to proactively deal with behavior before it escalates into something, kind of knowing the tendencies of when you're either losing the classroom or losing a specific student, and how to jump in before that spills into something bigger or starts roping in other kids. And then procedures are just the regular procedures that exist in your classroom that students internalize, and it helps things run smoothly. Um, yeah, I mentioned this before. Are you modeling the behavior you want your students to practice? Are there clear and concise rules that everybody can visibly see? They can either be something that is displayed on your classroom wall, which I highly recommend. It can also be something that is on your course content website. It can also be in the syllabus that your students should have access to and that parents can have access to. It should be visible in a lot of different ways. And also, are you deliberate in your response to behavior? And what that means is that you kind of think through the cultural coding of it, and rather than jumping to the worst possible conclusion or being reactionary, are you kind of thinking through all the different layers of it, so then you can have an appropriate response to it rather than what tends to be more negative? And then finally, it seems really simple, but do you greet your students every day? And this is one that I've actually become a lot more aware of in recent years, and I could be a lot better at that. A lot of times, I am a lot more focused on like getting my classroom set up, because I'm an OCD perfectionist type, and that's something that I need to be more mindful of, whether it's standing at the door, whether it's greeting kids when I'm setting stuff up in my classroom, just that day-to-day stuff. It matters so much, and it builds to something so much more. Now, other useful classroom procedures, this also comes from culturally and linguistically responsive teaching and learning. I thought these were really useful, so I screenshotted them. They have a protocol for Let Me Hear You, where it's a call and response, and it's a way to engage students instantly. A lot of teachers do that. I could be better at it. I use like a clap cadence to do that. Otherwise, I've used a xylophone in the past. There's also the my turn, your turn, where it's used for participation and discussion when it's appropriate for one person to speak at a time. This one I probably will try to use more because I've had issues with kids talking over each other and it kind of turns into one person monopolizing the conversation. Okay, so I wanted to do a little bit of a breakup activity at this point of the presentation, so it's a little less talky, where teachers would use that checklist and it'd be printed off ahead of time, and they would go through the listed procedures marked on it, and they would indicate with either a plus or a one if they have a specific procedure in place for that aspect of the classroom. And specific procedure means anything that can be visibly displayed in the classroom, rules or syllabus, or can be easily explained to students. And then a minus for every procedure that doesn't have any sort of routine in place. Relatively quick hitter for teachers to do. And the caveat here is that for every zero or minus in the chart, they want to find a colleague that has a plus for that procedure and then ask them to share that procedure and how it was taught and practiced with students. Those procedure things are really important, and for a newer teacher or even a teacher who has become disenchanted, this can be a nice way to like refocus or recalibrate that. Now, the culturally responsive aspect of classroom community also really ties in, and this could honestly be its own separate workshop or professional development. So I'm only going to briefly touch on this. This is mostly going to be pulling from culturally responsive teaching and the brain, as well as teaching tolerance. And some of the suggestions that I thought were most useful here were getting in the practice of using validating terms with addressing cultural behaviors. Validating meaning that when you observe a behavior, you first of all want to see whether that behavior is completely unacceptable in class and it doesn't really have a cultural coding to it. It's something that's just flatly unacceptable. And in that case, you just address it directly. Whereas if it's a cultural behavior of some kind, you want to think of ways that you can frame it where it's like saying that you appreciate that behavior or that I value your point of view. And you want to avoid using the deficit terms because it kind of makes an antagonistic relationship with that student and any other student who's observing that interaction. It's also super useful to consider asset framing with students rather than deficit framing. And that also could be its own separate workshop where you start thinking of students in terms of what they can do rather than what they can't do. And that can tie into interests, specific learning styles that are effective to them, whether or not they're good at interacting with their fellow students or anything of that nature. You also want to make sure that you're varying your activities enough to keep students engaged, but you want to be mindful about having a variety of activities that appeals to a variety of different learning styles and also cultural sensibilities. And just in general, you want to try to work movement into your lessons whenever possible. I know that I'm not great at that because sometimes I think it is a little difficult to get students back into place after the movement. But I think if you have specific procedures in place in it and keep the movement relatively brief or have only one task attached to it, it's something that can be pretty quick and easy and it doesn't really detract from your class in any way. And for a lot of students, that just getting the blood moving or getting their limbs moving can really just refocus or recalibrate themselves. I also would highly recommend finding ways to interject student culture into your lessons whenever possible. As a social studies teacher, that is pretty easy for me to do, especially with geography, but that's something that can really tie in with other classes as well. You also want to be able to find content related texts and materials that come from a variety of different backgrounds. Again, in social studies, that's fairly straightforward to do, but I do understand that in other subject areas, that is pretty possible to do as well, as long as you are actively researching and constantly updating. Also, really be mindful about seating charts, especially after you kind of get established which students work well with each other. And also, the culturally responsive teaching in the Brain book recommends structuring seating charts in a way where kids from different cultural backgrounds are sitting by each other as well. So that way you get a more robust conversation. And this is just a small one, but proper pronunciation of names is so important. And it's something that I've struggled with a lot in the past. And I'm trying to think of like naming activities that would make it so kids say their names more often, because the pronunciation thing is so big with the general respect thing and just building one on one rapport with a kid. Now, building classroom community, it's a no brainer here. Any teacher can tell you start early. And that means icebreakers. And icebreakers I would generally define as singular activities that you do early on in the school year, and you really only have to do them once, or they can be like a small recurring thing for a week or two. And the benefits of them, well, there actually is some academic backing for that. And first of all, they develop and optimize creative thinking. They eliminate boredom and anxiety. They train students to interact and work together. It increases self confidence and comfort level. And it's also an opportunity for you to introduce classroom procedures so students get in the habit of doing that. And a pro tip, just based on my experience, but also based off of some different websites about icebreakers, you want to use activities that encourage peer to peer interaction, also peer to teacher interaction, so that way you can get to know the student. Also, an activity where students have to say their names either to other students or to yourself because of the pronunciation thing. And also, students sharing something about themselves so they become more comfortable with their own culture and perspective in the context of the classroom. So this part of the presentation is where I start diving into resources that are both like combinations of my own resources and also just stuff that you can find with relatively quick Google searches. An activity I've had really good success with in the past for an icebreaker on the first day is global studies bingo, where students would go around the room and try to find other students that would agree or affirm the statements that are in the bingo spaces. I've added an interview element of it where they actually have to ask a follow-up question. Like, for example, if they've been to an ocean, they have to say which ocean they've been to. If they speak another language, they have to explain what language that is. That's a great activity for me when it comes to kids learning to interact with each others, but also for me interacting with them, because I'll participate in it and offer guidance and kind of pause things occasionally to get kids to elaborate further. And then at the end of the activity for a wraparound, it works really well as like follow-up questions for specific students. It helps you get to know them better, and it can also serve as the launching point for a lot of different discussions in later classes. And then here's a listing of other really great icebreaker activities. I'm not going to go into too much detail for them because there's links in the presentation themselves. The Play-Doh activity comes courtesy of Burgess's Teach Like a Pirate book. The deserted island game just supposes that they are stranded on a deserted island and they have to pick items for survival. And it's actually a pretty good sequenced activity that can even take a whole lesson if you want it to. This or that is where students stand in different points of the room based off of what their opinion is on certain things. Mini golf challenge is where they have to build their own like mini golf holes, and it's actually kind of a cool kinetic opportunity with different groups. Marshmallow challenge is used in a lot of STEM programs, and it involves students trying to build a tower to balance a marshmallow using spaghetti. Paper airplane challenge speaks for itself. 10 fingers is where students in groups hold up 10 fingers and they say different statements about themselves. And if that applies to other students, they can put their fingers down or keep them up, depending on what sort of structure you want to do with it. And then word hands is where they write different words to describe themselves on one sheet of paper, and then they draw out an outline of their hand, and then they use those words along the outline of their hand. So that way it turns into kind of a visual element that can display in your class as well, which actually ties into culturally and linguistically responsive teaching, where you display student work regularly. There's also the cup stacking challenge and Wuzzles. For the record, Wuzzles actually has some academic studies on its effectiveness for both building community and for like visual and linguistic learning. All right, so after you have laid the groundwork for classroom community with your icebreaker activities, you can then start getting into what I call recurring activities. And those are daily startups that are a little bit more content specific. So, this part you can kind of take with a grain of salt if you are not a social studies teacher, but some of these I think actually could be modified to fit for other content as well. The benefit of doing these recurring weekly activities, and this is pulled from an academic study directly, it simplifies a complex environment and informs students on what to expect, what is expected of them, and what is acceptable behavior. Or to put it more simply, kids know what to expect when they walk into a classroom, so they have less anxiety about that, and it doesn't use as much bandwidth for them. I have an example of this with weekly 5 to 10 minute startup activities that are slightly more content specific for me. One of them comes courtesy of Dave Burgess's book, and that's Music Mondays, where you have a song related to the topic you're teaching playing when students walk into the classroom. Well, an example of this, I have a unit I teach on the different world religions, where I just kind of go over some of the cultural elements of them. And you could play, for example, George Harrison's My Sweet Lord as they're walking in. And then you would kind of break down that song and then ask students why that relates to, or how that relates to the topic you're teaching. And it can kind of learn as a discussion point or balance off as that going forward. And then as a bonus, kids can actually start requesting songs later that can tie into the class content. And you can even use it as a request slip where they have to describe how the song relates to it. So that way you start getting them incorporating the vocab in a certain way. Topical Tuesday is a trivia game I play with weekly current events quizzes published by Slate, New York Times, CNN, and BBC. There's a few other ones that will publish sporadically, including one from India. As a bonus, you can turn that into a team Kahoot to ramp up the competition, and you can even do it as a casual scoring thing for like a classroom challenge that's not necessarily graded, but it can tie into content in some way. Also, for the record, none of these are things that I've done as graded activities either. So some kids might be indignant about that, but I think once you establish the importance of community, you're going to get pretty good buy-in from most kids. Now, Worldwide Wednesday is something I've done last year, and it involved where I would display a bunch of cultural, historical, and geographic images of a mystery country. And then from that, student groups would have to guess that country based off of the evidence presented. And in that regard, I've got a link to that specific activity with the slides. I've also got a resource document for it as well, where I pull from, I think, Geography Now, CIA World Factbook, and I think a BBC site for it. Pretty good activity when it comes to critical thinking and geographic reasoning, and I think that can be modified somewhat that would fit for other topics as well. And then Trivia Thursday is where you do a quick hitter review of some of the major concepts covered in class. WordWall is an excellent site for that, but teachers also might be more familiar with like a Gimkit or a Blookit. Or Quizlet is another great one where you would just have a Quizlet or have kids make their own Quizlet if you want to empower them to do so. And Flocabulary Friday. So Flocabulary is a paid site that's mostly for social studies teachers, but it can also be used for science. And that's where you have table groups try to predict which stories they think will be featured in the Flocab's weekend wrap video that publishes Friday morning. It's a paid subscription, so students wouldn't really be able to do the prep work ahead of time on that. They would have to just think to themselves, well, what's the major news of this week and how might that be featured in the video? Another idea I had for this that might be a little more labor intensive is called Mindset Monday, or if you have some other really clever alliteration, it's where students would consider where they stand on issues using either the Perspective website or Flipside as a reference point for those topics. I think that could be pretty useful, but it might be something where you have to curate ahead of time. And I know for startup activities, you don't want something that's that labor intensive. So that's more of a suggested one. Then my works cited for this, I've got my books and then academic studies cited there. And then also, these are the other websites I referenced. So that's pretty much what I've got for this presentation. Let me know if you have any questions for it, and hopefully you got something from this that you'll find useful. All right, thank you.